A cop thought he was about to teach a black man a lesson at a gas station, until 3 black SUVs pulled up and flipped the entire power dynamic in an instant. The gas station sat on the edge of a quiet highway, its flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the pavement. It was late, well past midnight, but Daniel Harris had grown used to driving through the night. The long stretches of open road gave him time to think, to decompress from the weight of his job. He wasn't in a rush. He pulled his sleek black sedan into an open pump and stepped out, stretching his shoulders before grabbing the fuel nozzle. He had barely started filling his tank when he saw the reflection of flashing red and blue lights in the rear windshield. A police cruiser slowed as it entered the lot, rolling to a stop a few yards away. Daniel didn't react at first. It wasn't uncommon to see patrol cars doing their rounds, checking for drunk drivers or suspicious activity. But then, through the driver's side window, he saw the officer's silhouette. Still, watching, waiting. The door swung open, and a young cop stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His hand hovered near his baton, like he expected trouble. Daniel exhaled through his nose. He already knew how this was going to go. "Evening," the officer said, his voice sharp, edged with authority. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Daniel turned, resting an elbow on the roof of his car. "Getting gas." His tone was calm, but firm. The officer squinted, as if he didn't like that answer. "This your vehicle?" Daniel glanced at the car, his car, then back at the cop. "It is. Gonna need to see some ID." The officer's stance shifted slightly, legs widening, shoulders squaring. Daniel studied him for a moment. The way his fingers twitched, the way his eyes flicked toward the empty lot, checking for witnesses. There was no reason for this. No law broken, no cause for suspicion, just a man at a gas station. But Daniel knew that wasn't enough. He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Is there a reason for this request?" The officer's jaw tensed. "You're acting suspicious." A statement, not a question. Daniel tilted his head slightly, holding the officer's gaze. "Suspicious how?" "You're out here late, dressed all fancy." The cop gestured at Daniel's tailored navy suit, his polished shoes. "Doesn't fit the area." Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "So, what exactly would fit the area?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his weight and took a step closer. "Hand over your ID." Daniel didn't move. "Am I being detained?" The question made the cop's eyes flash. A muscle in his cheek twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again." His fingers grazed the handle of his baton. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gas pump clicked, signaling a full tank, but neither man moved to end the standoff. Other customers lingered at a distance. A man adjusting his side mirror pretended not to notice. A woman refilling her soda at the station's entrance slowed her steps, watching carefully before quickly slipping inside. Daniel had been in situations like this before, too many times to count. He knew how they ended if handled the wrong way. But this time, something in the air felt different. And the officer? He was just getting started. The air between them felt heavier now. Daniel could see it in the officer's stance, feet planted wider, chin slightly raised, like he was waiting for an excuse. Daniel wasn't about to give him one. "I asked you a question," he said, voice measured. "Am I being detained?" The officer took another step forward, now close enough for Daniel to see the sharp glint in his eyes. "You're being investigated." "For what?" The officer scoffed. "Loitering. Acting suspicious." Daniel exhaled slowly. He could argue, call out the absurdity of it. But he knew how quickly things could escalate when a cop like this got his ego bruised. Instead, he kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his tone steady. "I just filled my tank. That's not loitering." The officer ignored him. "You got drugs in the car." Daniel blinked. "What?" The cop's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "What's in the trunk?" Daniel shook his head. "You have no probable cause to search my car." A sharp breath. The officer's fingers curled around the baton at his hip, and for a split second, Daniel saw something dangerous in his expression. That's when it hit him. This officer didn't just want control. He wanted a reaction, a flinch, a stammer. a moment of fear to justify what he was already planning to do. Daniel had seen it before. The false charges, the resisting arrest accusations, the injuries that later became self-inflicted. He knew the game, and he knew how it ended. But before he could decide what to say next, the officer's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Step away from the vehicle." Daniel didn't move. The officer's jaw clenched. His fingers flexed around the handle of his baton before finally pulling it from his belt. "I said..." "I heard you," Daniel interrupted, his voice unwavering. The silence that followed was thick with warning. At the far end of the lot, the man adjusting his mirror had frozen, watching closely now. The woman inside the store hovered near the glass, her phone gripped in both hands. Even the gas station attendant, an older man behind the counter, was shifting nervously, his eyes darting between Daniel and the officer. But no one stepped in. No one ever did. The officer's grip on the baton tightened. He was waiting for the slightest twitch, the smallest movement to use as an excuse. And Daniel could feel it coming. But then, headlights flooded the station, piercing through the tension like a knife. The sudden flood of headlights washed over the gas station, stretching long shadows across the pavement. The officer flinched, his grip tightening on the baton. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could already sense the shift in the air. Engines rumbled as the dark SUVs rolled to a slow, deliberate stop near the gas pumps. Tinted windows, blacked-out rims. These weren't ordinary vehicles. For the first time since the encounter began, Daniel saw uncertainty flicker across the officer's face. Inside the gas station, the woman by the window pressed her phone tighter in her hands, eyes darting between Daniel and the SUVs. The man at the far end of the lot, the one who had been pretending not to see, now fully turned in his seat, watching. Even the attendant behind the counter stood a little straighter, his hands hovering near the register, as if preparing for something to unfold. The officer's gaze snapped back to Daniel, suspicion clouding his expression. "Who the hell is that?" Daniel didn't answer. The SUV doors swung open in near unison. The unmistakable click of dress shoes against pavement followed. The men who stepped out were sharp, well-dressed, clean-cut, moving with quiet precision. But it wasn't just the suits. It was the way they carried themselves. Straight backs, unwavering focus, earpieces tucked discreetly behind their ears. The officer's entire posture shifted, his confidence wobbling just slightly. He wasn't stupid. He recognized the stance, the controlled movements, the type of people who didn't walk into a situation. They entered it with purpose. His eyes flickered between them and Daniel, trying to piece it together. And then, one of the men, a tall figure with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. He didn't even glance at the cop. "Sir," the man said, his voice cool, professional, "are you all right?" He was speaking directly to Daniel, ignoring the cop completely. The shift was immediate. The officer stiffened. His grip on the baton loosened ever so slightly. He took a half step back, clearing his throat. "What's going on here?" The agent didn't respond. Instead, two more men from the SUVs took position near Daniel's car, their eyes scanning the scene, reading the moment like trained professionals. The officer swallowed hard. Daniel, still calm, met the cop's gaze. "I was just explaining my rights to him." The words were simple, but they landed like a hammer. For the first time, the officer hesitated. The baton at his side now felt like dead weight in his grip. The authority he had wielded moments ago, it was slipping. But he wasn't ready to back down just yet. Not until he knew exactly who he was dealing with. The officer's fingers twitched near his baton, but he didn't lift it. Not now. Not with three men in tailored suits standing between him and Daniel. His breathing had changed. Less controlled, a little shallow. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and worst of all, he could feel it. One of the agents took a slow step forward, hands relaxed at his sides, but his presence carried an unspoken authority. The kind that didn't need raised voices or empty threats, the kind that made things happen. The officer squared his shoulders. "Someone gonna tell me what's going on here?" His voice had lost some of its earlier bite. The agent who had spoken first finally turned to him, leveling him with a calm, assessing look. "And you are?" The cop blinked. "Officer Grant, LAPD." The agent nodded once, like he'd just checked a box on a mental list. "Officer Grant, do you have a reason for detaining Mr. Harris?" The way he said it, "Mr. Harris," was intentional, precise. The officer hesitated. He was acting suspicious. The agent's head tilted slightly, unimpressed. "How so?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed again. He had plenty of answers before, but now under this man's gaze, none of them felt right. He shifted uncomfortably. "I asked for ID," he refused. The agent's expression didn't change. "Is that a crime?" Silence. One of the other agents took out a phone, tapping the screen. The officer caught the movement and instinctively stepped back. What is this? Who are you people?" The first agent sighed, like he was already tired of this conversation. "Secret Service." 2 words. That's all it took. Grant's entire face shifted. Recognition. Then alarm. His eyes darted to Daniel, really looking at him for the first time. The expensive suit. The calm confidence. The fact that these men with power, weren't just here for him. They were here because of him. The officer swallowed thickly. His throat worked around an apology that refused to form. One of the agents pulled something from his pocket. A badge. He held it up just long enough for the officer to see. "Mr. Harris is a high-ranking government official," the agent said, his voice clipped and professional. "You just detained him without cause." The officer's Adam's apple bobbed. He could feel sweat beading at the base of his neck. "I didn't." He exhaled sharply. "I wasn't detaining him. I was just—" The agent raised a brow. "Just what?" Grant didn't answer. Because there was no answer. The gas station was completely still now. No one was pretending not to watch anymore. The man in the car, the woman at the window, even the cashier inside. They all saw it, saw the power flip in an instant. Grant took a shaky step back. His baton, once an unspoken threat, now felt useless at his side. Daniel studied him, his expression unreadable. And then finally he spoke. "I was just about to explain my rights to him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but it landed, 'cause for once, Daniel wasn't the one standing in defense, the officer was, and he knew it. The officer's breath was uneven now, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but stiff with uncertainty. The weight of his mistake settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The gas station was silent except for the distant hum of passing traffic. No one spoke. No one moved. They were all waiting. For what? Even Grant wasn't sure. The first agent, salt and pepper hair, unreadable expression, tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Harris, do you want to press charges?" The words hit the officer like a hammer. His stomach twisted. "Charges?" His voice cracked just slightly, and he hated himself for it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the man who had been so quick to flex his authority. The man who had demanded submission, expecting none of this to matter. Now, he stood exposed. Daniel could say the word, and that word could end him. The officer swallowed, his fingers twitching at his sides. His badge felt heavier than it ever had before. He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. His mind was spinning, searching for something, anything to regain footing. "Look, I didn't know who you were." A weak excuse. An admission, though he probably didn't mean it that way. Daniel let out a quiet breath, shaking his head just slightly. "That's the problem," he said. "It shouldn't matter who I am." The officer's face burned. Another agent took a step forward. "We have this entire interaction recorded," he said flatly. "Dash cams, witnesses, stall cameras." Grant's pulse pounded in his ears. His gaze flickered toward the gas station. The woman was still standing by the window. The man in the car hadn't looked away. They had seen everything, and he knew how this would play out if it went public. Suspension, investigations, maybe even worse. The sweat on the back of his neck felt colder now. One of the agents checked his watch, looking at Daniel. "Sir?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw for a moment. Then finally he looked back at the officer. "You don't get to do this," he said, his voice calm but weighted. "Not to me, not to anyone." The officer couldn't hold his gaze. Daniel didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see the officer lose his job to feel justified. The lesson had already been delivered. He stepped toward his car, nodding at the agents. "We're done here." The agents didn't argue. They moved with him, smoothly, methodically, like this was routine for them. Grant could do nothing but watch as Daniel opened his car door, slid inside and pulled away. No sirens, no arrests, no last-minute power grabs. Just a man leaving a gas station, and an officer, left standing in the weight of his own failure. Officer Grant stood frozen, watching Daniel's taillights disappear into the night. The SUVs lingered for a moment longer, as if giving him one last chance to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. Then, one by one, they pulled out of the gas station, gliding back onto the road with an eerie smoothness. And just like that, it was over. But for Grant, it wasn't. His pulse was still hammering against his ribs, his hands still clammy despite the cool night air. His entire body felt rigid, locked in place by the weight of what he had done, or almost done. The gas station remained silent. The woman by the window turned away, finally stepping back into the store. The man in the car shook his head slightly before driving off. The cashier behind the counter lingered for a few more seconds before disappearing into the aisles. No words were exchanged. No one needed to say anything, because they all knew. Grant had been exposed, not by force, not by violence, but by something far worse: accountability. He had pushed, expecting submission. He had threatened, expecting obedience. And for once, power had been out of his hands. The realization sat heavy in his chest. The way Daniel had handled himself, unwavering. The way those agents hadn't even acknowledged Grant as a threat. The way his authority had meant nothing the moment real power stepped in. Would he have gone through with it? If those SUVs hadn't arrived, would he have slammed Daniel against the hood of his own car? Would he have forced him into cuffs, justified it with some nonsense about resisting? The thought made his stomach twist, because he didn't know. Maybe, maybe not, but he had wanted to. That truth was the hardest pill to swallow. A sharp gust of wind rattled the loose sign above the gas pumps, snapping him from his daze. He took a step back, glancing around as if waking up from a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was a reckoning, one he wouldn't forget. He turned toward his cruiser, reaching for the door handle, but something stopped him, his reflection in the window. For the first time in a long time, he didn't like what he saw. There are moments that shift the balance, that rip away the false sense of control some people think they have. Tonight was one of those moments. For too long, men like Daniel Harris have had to navigate these encounters carefully, balancing between calm and survival. But why should they have to? Why should the outcome of a routine stop depend on status, on whether someone has the right connections, the right protection? What happens to the men and women who don't have black SUVs pulling up to save them? What happens to the people no one is watching? It's easy to ignore a problem when it doesn't touch you. But eventually, silence becomes complicity. And the only way things change, really change, is when those in power are forced to confront their own reflection. Because once you see yourself for what you really are, you can't unsee it. If this story made you think, good. But thinking isn't enough. Action matters. Awareness matters. Too many people don't get the chance to walk away like Daniel did. Too many people don't have the privilege of proving their humanity after being treated like a threat. If you believe in justice, in fairness, in a world where who you are matters more than how you look, then make sure to stay informed, speak up, and hold people accountable. Because the next time a moment like this happens, who will be watching? Who will be standing on the right side of power?